So we are going to talk about questioning today. And early on in my career, I had a manager who was an early mentor of mine, and he told me once, Julie, selling isn't telling. Selling is engaging, and the way you engage is through questions. And I thought this was interesting. This top stat that I have on this screen is based on some research that Value Selling just did. It's not even published yet. It's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. But we surveyed companies during the pandemic. Actually, the survey started about the second week of July and ran through August. And we asked them a number of questions. But if you're doing well, what are some questions that, what's going on? And also, if you're not doing well, what's going on? And 55% of the companies that report doing well, specifically during the pandemic, and are experiencing revenue growth, told us that asking insightful questions is a required skill within their sales organizations. So we're going to give you a synopsis today of the questioning process that is the foundation, the fuel, if you will, of the value selling framework. One of my colleagues says that the value selling framework is activated through our conversational cadence of questions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm assuming that you are on this line because you recognize that it's the questions you ask and not always the answers that you have that help you deepen the understanding of your prospects and clients and create and manage opportunities for partnerships and doing business together. And we're gonna talk a lot about the types of questions, when to ask them, how to ask them, and all of that, and really talk about this. But questions are critical. It's always interesting to me in almost nearly all of the interviews, but sometimes certainly early on in my sales career when I would interview for people joining sales, they'd all tell me, I want to be in sales. I could talk to anybody. I love people. I love presenting. I could sell, ice to an Eskimo, the old saying goes, because I love to talk. But the reality is, the best salespeople listen more than they talk. We're told early on we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them proportionately. And that is true. And just to highlight that, I was working with a client earlier this week, and he told a story to his team about a situation they had with a key opportunity, key prospect, and they had secured a 30-minute meeting with this executive, and it happened to be in the government, but it could be anywhere. And they got 30 minutes with this very senior person in the Department of Defense, and they were trying to sell their services to him. And the sales rep was so excited that they got time on this guy's calendar that when they got into the meeting, the sales rep kind of approached it as, I've got so much insight that I want to share with him. I just want to make sure that I can make the most of that 30 minutes. And he talked and he talked and he shared information, and he talked about how great his company was and all their unique capabilities and how wonderful they would be to partner with. And at the end of the 30 minutes, the executive at the DoD was extremely polite, shook their hands. Remember back when we could actually shake people's hands? Shook their hands, thanked them for their time, dismissed them. And they never heard from that gentleman again. He never returned a call. He never agreed to follow-on meetings. And not only did that approach of just showing up and throwing up hurt that individual opportunity, it actually hurt them long-term in that agency for as long as that guy was in that role, in a decision-making role. So we really want to be careful that we ask and we engage and we don't talk too much. So what are we going to talk about today? And I've already seen a few questions in chat. Yes, today's session is being recorded, and yes, I will take any questions. So if you have any answers, you will have on the chance, throw them in chat, and we will answer them. And if you're as best we can throughout the session. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about questions. What makes good questions, and how do those questions relate to understanding our customers? The more we ask, the more we know, and the better off we'll be. Within the value selling framework and the core programs that we teach here and bring into our client organizations, we have 4 specific types of questions, and they're all used for different reasons, and they're all used at different times. So we're going to talk about what those 4 questions are and give you some examples, and hopefully leave you with some ideas about how you can craft some of your own questions to further advance your success with the opportunities that you're working on. So we believe that questions lead to solutions. We believe here at Value Selling Framework that the selling process should facilitate the buying process. Nobody wants to be sold. Everybody wants to buy when they find something that they want. So it's those questions that we ask that develop the relationship with our organization. You know, I often tell the story of, I've got a neighbor who's been very successful, and he's got lots of fancy cars, and he's got a big fancy house, and he's got a great vacation house, and he's just got a great life. And anytime I run into him, he is very excited to tell me about how great his life is. And as a matter of fact, at our neighborhood parties or cocktail parties, which we used to have, but haven't had in a while, you know, I would avoid this guy because it was just like, oh my God, me, me, me. All he did was talk about himself. He could care less about anybody else. And I think that that is true sometimes of how salespeople are perceived. It's me, me, me. Let me tell you about me. Let me tell you about my company. Let me tell you about my products. Let me tell you how great we are, how fabulous we are. And we don't know if we have a solution that could be relevant to anybody until we know that we have problems that we're solving that we can focus on. So questions lead to solutions, not presentations. And we'll talk about that. Now, there's a time and a place where we have to educate our prospect, and we have to contextually position what we do, but that's not how we lead. So what makes an effective dialogue? Well, an effective dialogue is all about trust and rapport. I am willing to talk to people that I think are genuinely interested in myself, both as a business professional and as an individual. And that trust and rapport is critical. When trust and rapport is high, people will share insight with you. And trust and rapport can be high in the business setting is important because we have to be relevant. Some of you have been on these sessions before, have heard me talk about a company that has a very similar name to mine, but in a completely different business. And there was a point in time when I was getting a lot of calls trying to sell me information for a retail store called Value Vision that sold eyeglasses and sunglasses and eyeglasses and prescription eyeglasses. It was kind of like a lens crafter, a regional lens crafter. I believe the company still exists. But all of those people, they weren't relevant to me. They had I had no interest in talking to them for obvious reasons, but it happens all the time as we're not relevant. The key to that effective dialogue is focusing on the other side of the table. It's not about us, it's about them. And people don't care how much we know until we know how much they care. We care. So we want to demonstrate that interest. We want to learn them. As a matter of fact, I tell people right out of the gates, I'm not sure I'm a fit for you and your company. I have some ideas that I might be, but let's talk about what's going on from your point of view together to see if there's a good fit. And if there's not a good fit, I'm not going to try to push a rope and fit a square peg into a round hole. That's okay. And I do that by engaging them and not pitching, not showing up and throwing up in the first set of meetings. So here at Value Selling, we call our questioning process the OPC questioning process. And the O and the P and the C all stand for 3 different types of questions that are really the fuel of value selling. And I'm going to start with open questions. For many of us in sales, we are very familiar with asking open-ended questions. And I'll go into some examples in a few minutes. But open-ended questions are designed to get the prospect talking. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no single word answer. They're questions that tend to be, tell me about, please describe, how, why, what, as opposed to a closed-ended question that might have a finite or a single answer. So that is the first tool in our OPC questioning toolbox that we work on. And we work on open-ended questions very deliberately throughout the entire sales cycle with our prospects. The next type of question is the C, and I'm going to come back to the P in a minute because the P is often the most challenging for salespeople and the most counterintuitive to salespeople. So confirming questions are the questions that we use to demonstrate our active listening. If I know I have to confirm what I've heard, I have to pay attention to what you're saying. And while it sounds really simple, of course I would confirm what I heard, it is often an overlooked component of the questioning process by many salespeople. And confirming questions are critical. They allow the prospect to clarify. They allow the prospect to elaborate or share deeper insight. And they also demonstrate to the prospect that we've not only heard them, but we understand what they've done, what they're saying. And then the third type of question is what we call a probing question. And probing questions, in contrast to open questions, are closed. They do typically have a yes or a no answer, or a true or a false answer, and are finite in nature. We use probing questions for a couple of reasons. We use them to expand what we might have heard in an open-ended question. So if I ask an open-ended question and they tell me that, A, B, C are going on there, I might probe to say, well, is D also something that you're experiencing? So it allows me to expand if something isn't volunteered in an open-ended question. And it also allows me to drill down and clarify on any of those areas that I might want more information about that. So probing questions are critical. So it's this dance between OPC questions in our sales calls that we teach people to skillfully and artfully execute to be more effective. So let's dive into those individually, starting with open-ended questions. By definition, open-ended questions are designed to get the prospect talking. I have asked an open-ended question in certain sales calls and literally not said another word other than kind of slight head nods and acknowledgement of what I'm hearing. For the next 20, 30 minutes, they just go on and on and on. Great stuff, lots of notes, and really important stuff. So open-ended questions are designed to get them talking. Examples are, tell me about what's going on here. Tell me about your organization. How are you organized? What is going on? What's a challenge? What's the hard part? How do you do this today? What's important to you? Can you describe some of that? Why is that? Why is this going on? Could be another way to get at some open-ended questions. And other examples can include, can you share with me a little bit about X? Can you describe this for me? Tell me a little bit about how you do this. Or tell me about what you're thinking. Can you elaborate on the business processes that you have here to execute on purchases like this? Can you describe all of the people that would be involved in this decision? So there's lots of different open-ended questions that we ask throughout the sales process that are really important to ask. They get the prospect talking and they allow us to learn what their point of view and the context is that we're working through. The second type of question is probing questions. These are typically yes, no, or finite answered questions. They dig deeper into an area. Sometimes the analogy we use is we peel back the onion to get at deeper understanding. Probing questions are used again throughout the sales cycle. And there's some different examples here that we can talk about. I mean, we could ask a probing question about problems. Are you experiencing XYZ as a challenge? Is this issue a challenge because of this specific problem? But we can also use probing questions in other areas of the sales cycle. And so here I talk about using probing questions in what we call identifying the power or the decision maker in the process. Does anyone else need to sign off on this? Will legal get involved? At what point does this get turned over to procurement? Does Susie have to weigh in on this solution? I can ask all kinds of probing questions around identifying all the people that need to be involved, for example. The same is true for identifying a plan, what we call a plan, which is the set of steps that a prospect goes through with us to realize the value of a partnership with us. Do you have a date in mind of when you need to see these results? Have you considered a date for a kickoff? When will, are you aware of when all of the individuals will be getting together that we might be able to include a demonstration or an education session to make sure that we can answer any questions? All of those could be examples of plan probing questions. So we ask these questions throughout the sales cycle and understanding some different areas. I mentioned kind of problem probing questions, solution probing questions. Hey, are you considering a third party? Are you considering an integration into your platform? Are you considering that whether or not you require language requirements or capabilities in the solution you're looking at? I want to do that. And the same is true in value. I can certainly ask probing, what can you define the measurable impact of this? Can you quantify the impact of this? Do you know how you're going to measure the ROI for this type of initiative? Do you know what is required to justify this purchase internally in your organization? All examples of probing questions that allow us to gain a deeper understanding of where they're at and what they're thinking about. So let's go to the third type, confirming questions. You know, if I were to meet you outside of COVID, when we're back traveling and running into each other, you know, the open and the probing questions tend to be our natural discourse of a conversation. If I run into somebody that I haven't seen in a long time, you know, I might open the conversation with, how are you? That's an open-ended question. Then I might follow that up, depending on how that answer that says, are you still employed with XYZ company? Are you still in sales? How are you handling the pandemic? Back to an open. So you could often go in between open and probe questions conversationally. We do it all the time. Personally, we just probably have never labeled those questions. Oh, now I'm going to ask my son if an open-ended question at the end of the school day. We never label them, but it's what we do in a normal conversation. Confirming questions, often we do not do in our personal conversations. So, you know, building on the conversation that I kind of role modeled, if I've run into you, I'm not going to end that conversation with, so let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're good, your job is good, your family's good. Did I get that right? So the confirming questions are a habit and a behavior that powerful salespeople and high-performing salespeople really make a habit of building, because it allows them to demonstrate they've actively heard and what they've heard and what they agree. It provides that prospect the mental image of agreement. So if you confirm back what you heard from me, I'm kind of nodding my head, yes, 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 as you share back what you understood. Confirming questions are also very, very powerful in that oftentimes our sales cycles happen over time. Very few of us, it's a one and done meeting, they sign, sealed, delivered, and we move on. For most of us, these conversations happen over time. And when anything happens over time, things change. So confirming questions are powerful ways to kind of reset and frame, has anything changed since our last conversation? And really, really critical in understanding from that perspective. So the fourth type of question, which is unique to the OPC question, because it could be a probing question or it could be an open-ended question, is a specific type of question that we call an anxiety question. And anxiety questions, the way that we define them, are designed to be a bit provocative. We don't always need anxiety questions. As a matter of fact, right now, I am very, very cautious on inserting any more anxiety onto anybody else's plate, because it just seems like in this time in our life and in our world, we all have more anxiety than we need. So you have to use them very carefully, because we don't want people to become overwhelmed with anxiety. But we do, in certain situations, want to be provocative and get them to think about something that maybe they're not considering today. So we often use anxiety questions when we have a prospect that is not acknowledging that maybe they have a reason to change, or not acknowledging that there's a problem that they could be looking at. We might also use an anxiety question if a prospect, in our questioning, we identify that there's another solution different from ours that they see as the best alternative. So I may try to use an anxiety question to surface that they might be at risk if they don't rethink that. Anxiety questions can be used to help reconnect to urgency and focusing on the success that you're doing. But anxiety questions by nature are provocative, they're assertive, and there are times where a well-placed anxiety question will actually help us further the conversation. So what and why are anxiety questions used? Well, they're used to really help us break the current thought process that a prospect has. Like I said, if an example might be, they don't recognize a problem that, based on your experience, we know that they probably have. An anxiety question may be a way to help recognize or get them to rethink that current thought process and recognize that they might be missing something. They are thought-provoking. They are very thought-provoking because they're designed to kind of reshape the point of view of the prospect at that point in time. And they're actually used to open an unexpected dialogue through shifting their thinking. But now here's a couple of things about an anxiety question. We definitely want to use them to try to get kind of an emotional reaction. We kind of want the prospect to kind of sit back and say, huh, I hadn't thought of that. Good point. And if we want them to say, I haven't thought about that, good point, we need to make sure that the questions are provocative but not insulting. We need to make sure that the questions demonstrate our knowledge and our insight and reflect our credibility, but aren't, again, insulting. And oftentimes anxiety questions, by definition, because we're trying to get an emotional response of anxiety, kind of focus a little bit on the dark side, the implications, the negative consequences that might be coming to them, which is one of the reasons that I think you got to be very careful with them, because they're not always good. And we certainly don't want to scare the prospect to death. We want to get some emotion that just gets them to kind of think about things a little bit differently. So we have this acid test, if you will, on our anxiety questions. Is it provocative? Does it actually achieve what we want them to achieve? Does it get them to think about the future? In other words, creating anxiety on things that we cannot impact in the past is not going to help you move the opportunity forward or create an opportunity. We want them to be forward thinking and not critical of what has been in the past. The past is past. Let's move forward. How do we go through it? And again, we want to be assertive and confident in our questions, but we don't want to be insulting. We don't in any way want to risk rapport or insult or offend the person that we're talking about. So how do we create anxiety questions? Well, oftentimes we can leverage research. We can leverage our own experience. We can begin with the end in mind. We can reference other customers. So at the beginning of this, I had a stat that said 55% of companies that are doing well and growing revenue during the pandemic reported that insightful questioning skills are a critical skill set. So if I was talking to someone who didn't think that their salespeople needed to ask good questions, I might turn that stat, that piece of research, into an anxiety question that might be used in those situations. So they can be really powerful. Leveraging third-party research, leveraging experiencing, leveraging other sales leaders in your role have shared this. Could you be missing something? Could your strategy be at risk because of missing that? Could be different examples of those anxiety questions. So anxiety questions, again, they should not be confrontational, but should be educational. That said, we do want an emotional response. And I'm going to just address one of the questions here that I see in chat. Where anxiety questions fit with OPC questioning framework? Here's where they fit. An anxiety question could be an open-ended question or a probing question. But it is a question with a specific goal in mind to be provocative and get a new thinking from that. So a couple of the examples I just shared, I think I shared one that was an open-ended question and one that was more of a probing question in those examples. So an anxiety question can be either one of those, and we only use them if we're not getting the insight and information we need without using them to create and advance an opportunity. So anxiety questions are used judiciously and situationally by the sales reps, and they could be either open or probe. They're provocative, they're challenging, they're expertise-based, and they are respectful. So here's a great example of, you may recognize these two individuals, Steve Jobs and John Sculley. John Sculley ran Pepsi. He was an executive with Pepsi when Steve Jobs, realizing that they needed Apple to have a consumer mentality, recruited John Sculley to come over to Apple in the early 80s. And Steve Jobs shared, this is what got John Sculley's attention, this particular question. So I just think it's an excellent anxiety. This would be an example of an anxiety question that's a probe. It's either answered yes or no. But this was an anxiety question that got John Sculley evidently to consider that maybe leaving one of the world's leading consumer companies of Pepsi to go to this technology upstart on the other side of the world, or at least the other side of the United States, might make sense. So some good things to think about. So let's kind of talk about what questioning means. For any of you that have been around me, you know that I wrote a book called Value Selling, Driving Up Sales One Conversation at a Time. And conversation is what we have in our sales calls. Conversation is what we use to execute these questions. And so there's a couple of things that make it a conversation as opposed to an interrogation. You know, our prospects are not in the witness stand, and they are not there to just deal with, you know, a rapid fire probing questions. We're there to have conversations with them. So when we say OPC, we often go between these open and probing questions. I'm gonna ask an open-ended question. I might follow that up with a probing question. Depending on how you answer that, I might go back to an open question and say, hey, tell me a little bit more about that. Or can we talk about that? Or why isn't that a problem? Or why is that a problem? Can you share some of that information? So we tend to go back and forth between open and probing questions. One of the things that I think is really also important is to think about questions that are easy to answer. I often hear sales reps like they cram like 4 questions into one. So really force yourself to ask one question at a time. One question at a time, and make sure that you give them time to answer, which means we have to be patient. We have to allow for some time where we actually allow them to think and respond. And let me tell you, that's even harder on virtual. For those of us that are doing everything virtually, which is virtually all of us right now, once we ask a question, they need time to hear the question, absorb the question, think about the answer, process the answer, and do that. So one of the tips that one of my colleagues shared is ask a question, then take a sip of water. Ask a question, then take a sip of coffee. It allows you to force yourself to pause and force them to do it. But you have to be patient. And if there's a silence and someone is thinking, resist the urge to fill it with chatter or to move on beyond that question. Because if there's a silence and they are thinking, that could mean that that is the question that is going to get you the answer that's going to give you some real deep insight. So just thinking about that. Ask a question, take a sip of water. Force yourself to have patience and have some conversations with our prospects. So we're going to kind of talk about some of the keys to success here. And if you have any questions, Julie will go through some of these. Please, use chat and we'll answer as many of them as we can as we go through this. But the key to asking good questions is being prepared. Having an objective every time we talk with a prospect and knowing what we need to learn in order to achieve that objective. And if we know what we need to learn to achieve that objective, then we can create the questions to drive that conversation in the direction that meets our objectives. And that's really powerful. And then thinking through your conversational style so that it doesn't feel like an interrogation and it's a conversation. One thing I've learned over the years that I've been doing this is every salesperson that I've talked to, I haven't run into one that doesn't think that discovery isn't important. I do discovery, and almost every sales process that I've seen documented, discovery is in the first third of the stages somehow identified. Discovery, and then you qualify it, and then you advance it and negotiate or whatever it is. So discovery. But what I've learned is discovery doesn't just happen at the beginning of your sales cycle. Discovery is ongoing. And every time I meet with a prospect, I have an opportunity to learn more. And things change. So every time I have a conversation with a prospect, I have an opportunity to clarify and deepen my understanding. Context is critical. And it can be really powerful. So having preparation, thinking through what your objectives are, and thinking that questions aren't just at the front end, but they are throughout the sales cycle are really, really important. So critical to do it. And then anxiety questions when you need them, be ready for them. When we need them is often when there's some high tension or high stress in the sales call and they're hard to come up with on our own. So have some prepared so that you have them in your back pocket should you need them. Then as we get ready for questions, let's talk about this funny little cartoon here. But the reality is when we do a really good job, we lead them on the path and we facilitate their journey to do business with us. And so I just love this. And I love the fact that Julie Bregan shared that quote from one of our clients from a program a few weeks ago. Sometimes salespeople are afraid to ask questions because they think they know the answers. But it is so powerful to capture the answers in the prospect's own words and understand from him or her or it what the exact point of view is and how they look at that.